So in our continuing meander through television, we in the last couple of weeks we watched hilarious House of Frightenstein and You Can't Do That on Television as like the sort of the wilder side of Canadian kids TV. So then this week to take the other side of the coin, I was gonna kind of skip out on these of like Mr. Dressup and Friendly Giant and like the nice kid shows, but then we decided to go that way because Friendly Giant in particular, I didn't realize it stretched back as far as it does. So, you know, like you were saying how your youngest sister, it was on TV a bit when she was little and stuff. We'll get to that second though, because like, we're gonna do Mr. Dressup first. So it's weird. It's like I feel like maybe the nostalgia will be kind of neat. These are obviously not going to be like riveting shows to watch, you know, it's just kind of nice to go back to them. But a good excuse to look stuff up because I just learned a bunch of weird stuff that I didn't realize about these shows. And it's just weird that I happened to coincidentally pick these two, Friendly Giant because you remember it more and Mr. Dressup is the one I remember more. I mean, I saw both of them as a kid. But there's a lot of strange similarities between these two guys, Mr. Dressup and Friendly Giant, that I had no idea. But we'll do Mr. Dressup first. So it ran from 1967 to 1996 with 4,000 episodes.
Mr. Dressup, 1967. Geez, I would have thought he was around earlier than that.
See, whereas in both these cases, I thought the opposite. Because I was a kid in the 80s, I thought these shows were new in the 80s. I didn't know either of them went back far like this. It replaced a show called Butternut Square, which ran from 1964 to 1967, which here I've got. It's weird. This is what's on YouTube. I don't know what this is because it's not like an actual clip. It's just little bits. So it doesn't really make sense. But I'll show it to you real quick just to see old school Ernie Combs as he played Mr. Dressup on this show. And Casey and Finnegan were also on this show. And then, yeah, I don't know where this came from, but now it just keekeeps cutting. It doesn't show anything that makes any sense. So anyway, but that's just a little example of this was the show first, and that's where Mr. Dressup came from. He was the guy on the show who had the tickle trunk, who that always had the outfit that he needed, and Casey and Finnegan, the puppets, were on it. So they basically just, when that show got canceled, they were like, well, let's just make Mr. Dressup have his own show. So that's where that came from. And then Mr. Dressup, you know, went on for forever. And and it's weirdly related to Mr. Rogers a lot more than I thought. Like as a kid, I always just thought, you know, Mr. Dressup, Mr. Rogers, it's natural to conflate them because it's such similar shows. And like I was saying last week, I didn't even realize one was Canadian, one was American. I had no idea that anything was Canadian back then. You know, I just thought it was TV. But yeah, it was weird. So it took me a little while to untangle this because they kind of bury the lead where they say Mr. Dressup was Mr. Rogers' understudy, but then it says Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was often compared to Mr. Dressup, but Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood debuted a year after Mr. Dressup. So I was like, what the fuck's going on here? So I dug in a little more, and here's what's going on. Right away, surprised that Ernie Combs is not Canadian. He was born in Lewiston, Maine. So, I mean, almost very close to Canada. You know, Maine is just south of us, but technically was not a Canadian. Then Fred Rogers had a regional show called The Children's Corner in Pittsburgh, and Ernie Combs was his assistant puppeteer when so it was a show in Pittsburgh, and then they moved this Children's Corner show to Canada to do a Canadian regional version of it, and that's when Ernie Combs became his assistant puppeteer for the Canadian version. And then after that show ended, they basically pitched Ernie Combs, hey, what do you want to stay in Canada and be on this Butternut Square show? And he's like, yeah, all right. And then that became Mr. Dressup, and he just ended up staying in Canada for the rest of his life. He became a Canadian citizen. He received the Order of Canada. That's that award I mentioned last week that everybody gets, that I couldn't remember the name. And then he passed away in Pickering, Ontario in 2001. So yeah, he basically hitchhiked to Canada on the back of Mr. Rogers. And after Mr. Rogers went back to America, Ernie Combs just stayed here and Canadianed it up.
Yeah, became Mr. Dressup.
Yeah.
Canadian icon.
So that's kind of neat. So he is, I mean, we're not wrong. He basically is Canadian, and it was a Canadian show, but technically started, started in America.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And this episode we're going to watch, it was on YouTube. It's season 17, episode 6 from 1983. So this is more in the era that I would remember more. And then, like I said, there's a lot of parallels between him and the Friendly Giant, but I'll get into that when we do the Friendly Giant half. So for now, yeah, we'll just watch this, season 17, episode 6 of Mr. Dressup, which, yeah, like I feel like I remember this show pretty well, but I haven't seen it since I was a kid. And even reading through it, even stuff like Casey and Finnegan that were on every episode, I was like, oh yeah, right, that's what they were called. Like I just haven't thought about it in many decades.
We should get the music sound.
Yeah, I don't remember that either, but I'm sure it'll all come flooding back. Yeah, there it is. So, all right, so there's Mr. Dressup, and, I guess it's pretty pointless to criticize Mr. Dressup, obviously. I'm an adult now, and, he did his job properly at the time. I thought this show was great. So, yeah, sure, nowadays I think it's kind of boring, but why wouldn't I?
You're a 40-year-old man now.
Yeah. It'd be weird if I was still, way into it. I'm going to go watch a bunch of these.
But if you look at it try to remember what it was like being a little child. It was not bad. And what I liked about it, he didn't talk down to people. He talked to those children in the audience as if they were grown-ups or regular people.
And I did kind of like I was saying last week, that I always kind of respected how Blue's Clues had a half-hour-long single narrative that you're kind of supposed to focus on. And Mr. Dressup is similar-ish to that. Maybe Mr. Rogers was too, I don't remember. They do different stuff, but it is it's not, let's move it along. It's not the Sesame Street, make sure everything's always changing all the time. I kind of respect that it's let's just focus.
Look at a slow pace. Yeah. You had to watch him set up for the bank while they played bank. He didn't just say, oh, we're at the bank now. He actually set it up and told you how you'd set it up if you were doing that kind of make-believe. The cutting up the little doll's dress. He didn't just have the sock and everything already there. He actually got out his little sewing box, and he took out the scissors, and he took out the sock with the hole in the heel, and he actually created it.
Yeah.
So, which in real life is what you would have to do. You got to do some preparation.
Yeah, and it is funny, though, to watch it again as an adult and just to realize, I'm not cut out for that world at all. If I was making that show, I would constantly be thinking about the adults who might have to watch this with their kids and, what can we do here to make them entertained? What weird stuff can we slip in there that kids aren't going to notice that adults will think is funny? They obviously didn't care about that at all. This is an actual show for kids.
Yeah, and the thing that was good about it is, you shouldn't think about adults, because in the real world, here's what adults were doing. Little kitty was sitting there watching TV. Mom was out either cooking, cleaning, washing the dishes, keeping an eye maybe on little buddy and the TV, but she wasn't sitting down there watching that with him. She had things to do.
Right. So then the next thing, Friendly Giant, like I was saying, is very surprising how many parallels there were between these shows that I had no idea about. Even that there's a Canadian connection to Friendly Giant, I had no idea till today, till this morning when I looked this up. I had no sense that this was Canadian in any way. But much like Mr. Dressup, it's sort of a mix. It's, again, like I said, very similar. So this show ran from 1953 to 1985 with 3,000 episodes, so in the similar ballpark. But it ran from 1953 to 1958 in America, and then in 1958 to 1985 it became a Canadian show.
Really? It ran in the States.
So just like Mr. Dressup started in the States, and Bob Home, who played the Friendly Giant, was born in Stoughton, Wisconsin, another American Canadian. This guy wasn't born in Canada. And it's how Mr. Dressup was from Maine. Wisconsin's one of those places like Upper Michigan or even kind of Montana. There's almost Canada. They're extremely close. Wisconsin definitely gives me those Canada vibes. So this dude, Bob Home, he worked in radio, and him and his wife had this idea they wanted to do a kid's show. The idea of a Friendly Giant as the opposite of the Jack and the Beanstalk view of a giant, the big scary giant. they thought it would be cool to have a friendly giant. And also wanted the show to be laid back as opposed to the specific example they gave. High energy characters like Howdy Doody. None of that's, let's get all worked up and stuff. It's like, let's take it down. Let's calm down. So that's also very Mr. Dressup-y. So the show started in America, in Wisconsin, but then moved production to Canada. And again, it's just like, as far as I can tell, same thing as Mr. Dressup. Like, it was starting to run its course in America, and then Canada was like, well, come on up. We'll give you decades. We'll never stop. And again, this guy moved to Canada and never left. Just became an honorary Canadian. So not an honorary, an actual Canadian. Oh, and it was very loosely scripted. He wanted it to be based on this like comfortable repartee that like the classic radio duos would have, like just Burns and Allen or whoever, just bantering on radio. He wanted that kind of thing. So yeah, he became a Canadian citizen. He received the Order of Canada in 1998.
Now another one, okay.
Yep. And the way Mr. Dressup passed away in 2001, Bob Home died in Grafton, Ontario in 2000. So they even died around the same time and in the same geographical area of Canada. Like, just really strange how it's like you could switch the names on these articles and it would be almost the same, almost the same story. So since these are short, they're only 15 minutes each, I found 2 episodes. I found an episode from the 1960s that was just on YouTube as The Friendly Giant with no other information, but it said in the description 1960s. So you have to dig a little to find that one on YouTube. And then one from the 80s, from my era, is called Music of the World from 1982. So we can watch one of the old black and white ones and one of the new quote-unquote color ones that would have been more what I saw when I was a kid. I did find one of the really old ones from like the 50s from the Wisconsin run, but they were a half hour back then, and I feel like it's just not it's not right. That ain't The Friendly Giant as we know it.
Yeah, no, 15 minutes it would be enough.
And yeah, so you were saying that because again, this was a show I assumed was just from my era. I didn't know it stretched back so far, but you were saying how with your youngest sister, she was watching this.
Heck no, I was watching that.
Oh, okay.
I was watching that in that time frame. And they had that lovely theme song, Early One Morning.
Right.
Early one morning, just as the sun was rising. And in fact, that song, I remember being in like grade 2 in school, and we learned that song. And everybody, oh, that's a Friendly Giant music. Friendly Giant song.
I guess it's like, yeah, when you hear like the William Tell Overture or any classical song that was in Bugs Bunny, all that stuff that you're like, oh, that's from this. So yeah, we'll just watch these 2. And I guess this will be kind of interesting too, just to see, kind of like we did with You Can't Do That on Television, just did it change any from the 60s to the 80s, or did it just stay the same but become color?
Not far away. I used to know these words.
Bye-bye, friendly.
I always thought of Jerome as rather goofy and not really bright, but he's very bright.
So yeah, it's a little weird that we got 2 snow-based episodes, because I feel like those must have been pretty rare, because I don't remember snow ever. But it was kind of neat seeing the little miniatures and stuff and the little snowplow toy. But man, that's a perfect example of how I just don't have the mind for this. Is like with all of these shows, we've been talking about the repetition. That's where it all started, because Hilarious House of Frightenstein is so repeaty, and then You Can't Do That on Television, and then these shows, like, that they've been doing that song. We watched 2 episodes that are over 20 years apart, and they're still doing that song for 3,000 episodes.
But it's the commonality of, though, when you raise young children.
Right.
The most popular books, like, for example, with young children, are the ones that you read again and again and again and again. Nursery rhymes are so repetitious. But most young children don't just want to hear it once. They want to hear it 1,000 times.
Yeah, which again is where I just don't have the mind for it, because I'd be like, Every year. I'll give you a year, but every year we're doing a new song because I'm going to lose my mind. So I'd be mad.
But for young kids, that is, and that's how they learn to talk, through repetition,
Right.
listening to you saying the same thing again and again and again.
So yeah, the first thing I noticed on the credits of the first one is that Jerome and Rusty are just one guy who does the puppeteering and the voice for both of them, which is, as soon as I realized that, it's obvious. You can tell how it's set up, that's his two arms, and then you realize they never talk over each other. But I got to give him credit because I didn't realize that till I saw one name in the credits. So hey, he did a good job.
And then when you watch it, knowing that, you can see how certain actions happen by one man. And that took quite a little effort to do that and do it so well.
And again, just a similarity to Mr. Dressup, because obviously Casey and Finnegan were one person as well. But yeah, that was the giant really is giant. Like when they show those little teeny tiny chairs and stuff, and then his boot look way up. It's like, damn, that guy's real big.
Oh, I thought that was sweet.
And yeah, like the 15-minute thing is it's great.
It's perfect.
Yeah.
It's perfect because you really don't get bored in that 15-minute span. But if that had dragged on for another 15 minutes...
Because even like the fact that we watched two, so it added up to a whole half hour, but just that they were split really helped a lot.
And they were different. The first one was about stories and reading. The second one was music. And they introduced you to all kinds of music. They just didn't say, oh, here's a piece of music that we're going to play. They introduced who did it, famous artists like Mozart, Chopin.
Yeah, and the musical terms, like Rondo stood out to me because the reason I know Rondo is because every Castlevania video game has a musical title, and one of them is called Rondo of Blood.
And Jerome knows how to dance a rondo.
Yeah, it must be weird too with the color thing. Is like it's like a cutoff point where they were obviously rerunning. Like if the show ended in the mid '80s, I probably saw some of them when they were new, but a lot of the ones I saw must have been reruns. But they can't really rerun those old black and white ones. Like once TV turned color, it's kind of a shame. You just got to take all the old black and white ones and never play them again, because I wouldn't have stood for that as a kid. I'm not watching a black and white show, even though it's the exact same show. But once it's color, I got to have my color, you know?
Well, I would have seen some of those original black and whites.
Yeah, and it's weird they were both basically watching the same show, which is also something that, it just occurred to me now watching these. Because in my mind, it's always like, it's just like old guys host kid shows. It's just the way it is. But then seeing the old Friendly Giant or seeing Mr. Dressup when he was on that Butternut Square show, it's like, the reason old men always host these kid shows is because they used to be young men. And then they just do the show for 30 years.
Yes, and then they became old men. And children grew up with those and became old with them.
Yeah. Yeah, in both their cases too, and it's probably this way with like every single kid show guy ever. After the shows got canceled, then they went on like college tours because all of the kids who grew up watching them were in university at that point. So they would do like talks at universities to all these people that are in their 20s now that watched them as kids. It's remarkable how similar those two guys' careers were.
It's kind of nice too that they are such quiet, laid-back shows.
Right.
Because so much of what you see on television, especially today, is got to be fast-moving, high action, high-paced. But they're very calming. I mean, you sit down and Friendly Giant reads you a book. You sit down and you listen to 4 different pieces of music, and it's kind of nice.
Yeah, there we go. Because we could watch the other stuff, the Sesame Streets and the Mr. Rogers, but this whole podcast isn't about watching kid shows. I feel like that's enough.
And Mr. Rogers actually is very close to those two in the sense that it is very calming.
Yeah.
And when they get on the little train, it's not a train, but it's the
trolley.
The little trolley. Ding, 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 ding. Even that is slow. He has a very calming influence on children.
And actually,
where some of the others TV shows, like Sesame Street, for example, does not hang around and do a whole lot of that calming stuff. It moves very quickly, scene to scene to scene.
I was going to say, too, with Mr. Rogers, that initial scene where they swoop down on Mr. Rogers' neighborhood is very similar to the Friendly Giant. It's like, little toys, little diorama or whatever, little cars driving around it and stuff.
And when he goes into his house and he has to take off his shoes and he has to go over and get his sweater and then he has to put on his sweater. You see, it's all very slow. None of this. Gotta get the shoes off, get over there, get the coat on, get the coat off, whatever. We'll sit down. No, he's very. So he uses the same formula.
Yeah. So yeah, that's probably next week. I assume we'll stumble our way back to British zany comedies. But yeah, so that was interesting little side thing.
Yeah, a little break. Yeah.
And yeah, it is just kind of nice to jog my memory banks a little, because yeah, like it seems shocking to me now that it's like, how did I not remember either of those theme songs, particularly the Friendly Giant one? I mean, geez, like they weren't shy about it. And I mean, I'm sure I watched it 100 times, but it's been 35 years, I just forgot. So it's nice that this stuff is all just kind of there. If you feel like it, you can reach back. Although that's one thing I found really strange, is that my generation was the first generation where you suddenly had access to your childhood. Like back in the day, it's like Howdy Doody or whatever. You saw it, you remember liking it, and then it's gone. It's gone forever. You never see it again. Where I was a teenager when the internet hit, and it was that perfect time that instead of just remembering G.I. Joe and remembering Transformers but not having access to it anymore, here it is again. It's like the backwash right back in. And watching it when you're 16 and 17 and you're like, this fucking sucks. I thought this was good. I don't know, it's weird because it's like, it's better in some ways. I feel like the previous generations had it better when you don't get to watch the kids show again and realize what it was. Yeah. You just remember.
Well, certain shows will hold up and certain ones will not. Now those two that we watched today held up. But again, as I said at the beginning, you got to look at them as if you were looking through the eyes of a small child, because that's what they were geared for.
Right.
A good show is one that you can look at it all these years later and say, you know what? That's a pretty damn decent show.
Oh, I guess that's one last thing I'll mention too, is because the puppeteering that is lasted more or whatever is really the Jim Henson style puppets, kind of moved on to like Yoda and Star Wars and Labyrinth, those movies he made in the 80s, and even The Muppet Show and stuff, or Sesame Street, quite elaborate puppetry. And that is definitely one thing that is not the case in these shows. No. Casey and Finnegan and Jerome and Rusty are really simple puppets.
Yeah, simple little hand puppets.
Yeah.
And done by one guy. But, again, when you think about, there's one guy running those two puppets at the same time.
Yeah.
That's kind of impressive.
Yeah, I guess that's the benefit to them being such simple puppets, because I also saw a behind the scenes of Jim Henson stuff, and those are obviously much better puppets, but it's not that case at all. It's like a bunch of people just to make, like, it's amazing. That movie Labyrinth, there's like these scenes with a bunch of puppets, and it's like the whole floor is under the floorboards are just puppeteers, tons of them, and they can't use their hands because they can't reach that far. They got to use weird sticks and stuff. Really complicated and better, but yeah, it's kind of quaint in a way to see the. Although Casey is a little too simple. Like, he doesn't even have eyes. He's got black circles. He's creepy, but it's fine for a giraffe or whatever. It's true, though. Casey is just weird. Casey's personality is weird. Casey is a little off-putting, but...
Casey's a little different.
Yeah. We'll just leave it at that.